So, uh, yeah, I am going to try to do two or three things with you today. We'll have to see whether this is an overly ambitious agenda, as it often is. I was trying to finish out the series of discussions we've had over the last few weeks under the rubric abundance, affordability, and well-being. So finale is what I have on the right title there. And right, I've raised the issue, and I will continue to discuss the issue whether or not we have an affordability crisis or a well-being crisis in the United States, and then if it is a well-being crisis, how much of the crisis in well-being is rooted in economic factors, narrowly understood, how much, right, of affordable goods and services, especially essential goods and services, and how equally, fairly does our economy deliver? Or is it a broader well-being crisis? Is it a crisis that has to do with the way in which work and opportunity and life is structured in part by our economy, but also by our society? I do think that those issues are extraordinarily important, in part, as I've said, because I think that we're in a moment of what I'm calling regime polarization, right? Where really a substantial portion of the citizenry of the United States has come to the conclusion that the system of government that we have does not work for us. And by the way, Donald Trump yesterday in his press conference, right, I think manifested that attitude, just the rage at the quote disloyalty of the Supreme Court, calling them fools, lapdogs, that they'd been influenced by sleaze bags and foreign operatives, right? This idea that there's no respect, right? Clearly, but even um, acknowledgement, apparently, maybe not even comprehension of the idea of the rule of law and the role of constitutions and courts in maintaining the rule of law is indicative of the place we are at in our politics, where, right, we've elected a president who really is hostile to the entire institutional architecture of our constitutional system of government. And as I said to you, I think this is likely to continue until we get to the base of the sense that this system doesn't work for us anymore. So politically, this topic is extraordinarily important. I think also intellectually, philosophically, if the question is, what do we want from society in the 21st century? It's just a really important question to think through. And the ideas that it leads us to engage with, I hope, are intrinsically interesting. So, all that to say, that's my reason for not abandoning that topic despite everything else that's happening in the world. But let me talk about the stuff that is happening in the world first. And so I will just notice very quickly, right? And I ask, what will Trump do to save face and regain initiative, right? And please notice, right, that in light of the damage done to Donald Trump by the government shutdown in October, November of last year, we end up with, right, a president desperate to show, even though, right, Congress votes to release the Epstein files, that he is still the source of power. And so we end up with the invasion of Venezuela and the siege of Minneapolis. I do think we need to be worried that the likelihood of war, of the United States attacking Iran, has increased in part in light of yesterday's decision. I'll leave it at that, but obviously we have a major military buildup going on in the Gulf right now. And a president who appears to have very little compunction about using military force to punish those who he thinks do not do his will or show sufficient respect or deference for him. And we could go on to talk about the motivations, but also a president with very little long-term strategic vision, right? I think he really does think transactionally, and that the short-term decision-making process should worry us about the neglect of the long-term implications of an attack on Iran for regional stability in the Middle East. But that's not what I'm going to speak with you about from this week's news. I'm going to speak with you about what happened yesterday with the Supreme Court, and in particular, the case Learning Resources versus Trump, right? And this is the case that challenged the tariffs that were imposed under the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, IEPA for short, right? And the decision, clear and I think forceful and with very little wiggle room to get out from under it, that the President of the United States is not entitled to impose tariffs under IEPA, that this is not what this statute authorizes. And so let me begin with the decision itself. And I think one of the things to notice about the decision is that there are multiple concurrences in the majority and multiple dissents in the minority. And so it is a decision that is complicated and somewhat fractured. Let me start with the main decision for the majority, which is Chief Justice Roberts' decision, which is joined in full by Justices Gorsuch and Barrett. And their decision seems to, if you will, stand on two legs. One of them is a statutory interpretation leg. If you read IEPA, right, and there's one thing I think by Kagan where she says, look, there's 99 things that this statute authorizes, and it does not include tariffs, right? And so just the plain language of the statute says the president gets to regulate international trade, but based on 250 years of precedent, Congress has never meant by regulate tariff or tax, right? And tariffs are taxes, and right, the Congress has the power to tax under the Constitution. And John Roberts very forcefully says, right, that this statute does not constitute a delegation of those powers to the President of the United States. And the founders of our Constitution were very clear in assigning the taxation power to the to the Congress, in part because our whole revolution was fought on the basis of the question whether or not we should have taxation without representation. Congress is the representative body of our federal government. It is diversely constituted to represent the diversity of opinions of the United States. It is accountable, especially the House of Representatives, where the power primarily resides because they have elections every 2 years. And so the delegation of the power to tax from Congress to the president has to be explicit and clear in the statute, and IEPA does not do that. And I'm going to just notice something about, if you wanted to summarize what I just said, John Roberts said in this opinion in 2 words, I think it would be no kings, right? And that this is important. I'm not suggesting that John Roberts just joined the No Kings protest, far from it, but that at least on this issue, the Chief Justice and three of the conservative justices of the United States who Donald Trump accused yesterday of being disloyal and stupid and lapdogs, that they said no, right? That the President of the United States does not get to usurp all of the powers of Congress, is not an autocrat. And that is a significant and important decision. There is a second leg on which this decision rests, and I think it's important to notice this as well, and this is the so-called major questions doctrine. And it's worth noting, right, I say so-called because this is a very new doctrine. It's really only been relied on by the Supreme Court for a few years. In terms of its history, it's only about a dozen years old. And it says something stronger than what I've just said, which is that when a proposed regulation or exercise of power has major effects on the economy or society, the threshold of justification from Congress allowing the executive or executive administrative agencies, right? The whole panoply of three-letter agencies that exist now formally in the executive branch, from, right, the Environmental Protection Agency to the CDC, to the FCC, right, and Federal Trade Commission, et cetera, right? We could keep going. That if those agencies are engaged in addressing a major question that has major effects, then the authorization from Congress has to be specifically to impose that regulation. And so this is a doctrine that is, generally speaking, hostile to the regulatory state or the autonomy of the regulatory state when Congress has, for instance, in the case of the Environmental Protection Agency, said you need to protect clean air and water, and then we give you the authority to figure out how to do that. If the EPA is going to do something that has major effect, then no, it's not sufficient for Congress to say protect the clean air and clean water. It has to specifically authorize the EPA to do that. And I think it's extremely important that Roberts, Gorsuch, and Barrett also said, in differing ways, right, that the major questions doctrine applies to IEPA because tariffs have such a big impact on our society. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment, but I would also point out that Barrett and Gorsuch wrote concurring opinions because they disagree about how sweeping or important the major questions doctrine is, and in particular, what kind of principles of statutory construction, how it leads us to interpret statutes, where Barrett is indicating that she has a more modest and what she calls common sense approach to the major questions doctrine, and Gorsuch is indicating a more sweeping and more strictly textualist approach to the major questions doctrine. Now, there's a second, right, majority opinion, this one limited to the three liberals, in which they indicate that they agree with the three conservatives in the majority on their reading of IEPA, that it just doesn't authorize the president to impose tariffs. And that's all they need, right? It's a simple statutory construction case. And by the way, they continue to reject the major questions doctrine. I'll say more about this in just a moment, but I'll just point out that this probably means there was quite strong opposition to the idea that Donald Trump could use IEPA to impose tariffs, that the right conservative in the majority, Roberts, Gorsuch, Barrett, did not have the power to try to get Kagan, Sotomayor, Jackson to agree to the major questions doctrine in order to get them to strike down these tariffs, probably means that this was not a closed case. Having said that, I'll note that there are also several dissenting opinions, and I'm going to focus primarily on Kavanaugh's, and here, because right, Kavanaugh is one of the chief originators and proponents of the major questions doctrine, and the idea that his opinion is so contorted and hypocritical, frankly, right, in saying, well, yes, I'm a strong advocate of the major questions doctrine, but no, it doesn't apply in this case, right? And why doesn't it apply? Well, because this is an international case, not a domestic policy case. And when it comes to foreign policy, different standards apply. And what's ironic about this is that Kavanaugh, right, was in the majority and in fact issued one of the opinions in striking down Joe Biden's efforts to create relief for student loans, right, in the early days of the COVID crisis, and specifically in the executive order, right, appealing to the statute that gave him emergency power to issue relief from student loans. Biden pointed to an international emergency, explicitly described as such, that is the COVID crisis. And, right, Kavanaugh was not persuaded, right? And so I do think one of the things that we should look at, right, is the fact that, and by the way, right, the decision by Thomas, who was generally skeptical of delegation, right? But then he now has a powers of the crown exception. The reasoning again is so convoluted it barely deserves being taken seriously. But the idea that the right delegation doctrine in the Constitution has exceptions based on what the crown in Britain was allowed to do, and because the king was allowed to tariff. By the way, that's not true. And actually, there was a right, a substantial contribution to the British Civil War over whether or not the king was allowed to do that. The idea that there is right this three-member right of a nine-member body who appears to be basically willing to give Donald Trump the power to do more or less whatever he wants to do, and to right use pretzel logic to figure out how to justify always siding with Donald Trump, I do think raises an important issue, which I'll talk about in a moment, which is whether or not the justices of the Supreme Court are still acting in a way that we can recognize as principled constitutional interpretation, principled, right, construction of the meaning of statutes, legal reasoning, as opposed to simply partisan political reasoning. And I think, right, this decision gives us a little bit of hope that at least Roberts, Gorsuch, and Barrett are willing to follow their principles, even when they undermine things that Donald Trump wants us to do, wants them to do, right? But that maybe three of the justices of the Supreme Court are not, and we should be deeply concerned about that. So that helps me to pivot to the deeper question, I think: how much should we infer from this decision about the court's likely future decisions? And I'm going to say not a lot. I think that this is a really quite narrow decision. It turns on how you read a particular statute, and then on the major questions doctrine. And so it does not turn on the unified executive theory, right? And I will note that there's an important unitary executive or unified executive theory coming up, or case coming up, Trump v. Slaughter, which concerns so-called Humphrey's executor, right? A nearly 100-year-old precedent that says when Congress says the president cannot fire, right, at will, and then reconstitute the leadership of independent executive agencies or administrative agencies, that he has to respect that. And it does appear that the Supreme Court is getting ready to overturn Humphrey's executor and to give Trump the power to, in much more um, unrestrained ways, reconstitute executive agencies. There's separate cases to do with the Federal Reserve, the Lisa Cook case. We'll hopefully know about that pretty soon. But note that in many ways, the green lighting of executive power, of the use of unilateral and often apparently illegal or unconstitutional power by the president from this court, is not called into question by this case. And so the second thing I would note about this case is that it indicates that the majority on the Supreme Court, the conservative majority, is firmly committed to the major questions doctrine, and is going to probably continue to use this doctrine, which is made up, what was only announced very recently, to hamper the capacity of future presidents to impose regulations, or of executive agencies to impose regulations, and that is something that will need to be addressed if a Democratic president is going to be serious about climate change, if a Democratic president is going to be serious about the economic sources of a well-being crisis in the United States, the Democratic president is going to need to be able to impose regulations. And this is a doctrine that is designed to directly limit that capacity. There is, I think, a serious need to be thinking about what to do about a Supreme Court that is unilaterally claiming the capacity to undo the way in which, frankly, government has been practiced in the United States since the 1930s. So final thing I'll say is, watch out for what comes next. And so I worry a little bit that in a sense, this was the court, being able to stand up to the president in a case that didn't matter that much, and that they thought maybe actually helped Donald Trump, and so helped him to back away from a bad policy. As I said at the beginning, a different man might have said, well, I have to respect what the Supreme Court did, and I better change course, recognizing that the tariffs are actually failing and damaging us. But be that as it may, that we've seen this in other societies that are in the middle of an autocratic takeover from the executive, which is the courts, appear to show independence and to restrain the executive, but do so only in those cases that don't actually undermine the president's central authority. And so here I will just note, that the majority decision says nothing about what the remedy will be. And one way to think about that is that's been left to Donald Trump to decide. This decision maybe actually gives him, in certain respect, more powers. But in addition to that, what will the Supreme Court do next? Having shown some independence, appearing not to be as partisan, it has two important decisions that it will be reaching in the next months. One of them, Louisiana versus Kaye, I think looks likely to overturn Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which will basically make the Voting Rights Act dead letter, It will, all of the powers to do anything about gerrymandering or about other efforts to restrict access to the franchise will have fallen away with the Supreme Court's invalidation of Section 5 and Section 2. If this is what they're doing in Louisiana v. Kaye, we'll now have a Voting Rights Act that has no teeth, no power. And then, as I've called attention to, Trump v. Slaughter could very well give Donald Trump considerably more power. So just let's be cautious and not think that there's been a Saul on the road to Damascus moment with our Supreme Court. Yes, one good decision, but frankly, it may give them cover to issue a number of very bad decisions. The 140 billion, or maybe it's 170 billion, depending on whose estimate you listen to, question, will there be a remedy? If so, for whom, imposed by whom? And if you listen to Donald Trump's press conference yesterday, I'll tell you one thing that I do not anticipate, which is that the Trump administration will say, oh, the Supreme Court has said that we didn't have the power to impose these tariffs, and therefore we're going to refund all the money, right? So there are going to be a whole bunch of lawsuits, and we'll have to see how lower courts hold. And one of the issues then is going to be, by the way, that only big corporations with the power to and the resources to hire these lawyers and fight these cases and with the patience to let them work their way through the courts will likely get an eventual refund for the tariffs. And then in ways I'm about to show you, I think that the tariffs were not just paid by the importers, they were passed along in many cases to us. And I'll just make a bet, right? Which is that Learning Resources Incorporated, if it gets, say, a $4 million tariff refund, is not going to give everybody who bought things from them over the last year a refund or some sort of check that passes the refund on to them. So, just worth noting. Let's just spend a moment thinking about what the tariffs have done. And to date, they have created unpredictability, right? And so I just want you to notice, how the tariffs have gone up and down. And I'm sorry, this is the better diagram for looking at that. And then note, that they have uncoupled us in important ways from some of our key trading partners that were importing considerably less from China, considerably less from Canada. Mexico, if I've got it right, is almost stable, but considerably less from the European Union, more from the rest of the world, but still less overall, that at this point, roughly half of what is imported to the United States is either duty-free or exempted from duties. And then of the remaining half, basically 50% of the tariffs that have been imposed by Donald Trump, please note, they didn't exist before Trump took office. No other president had tried to use IEEPA to impose tariffs. 50% of these tariffs are now invalidated. One more thing to notice here, is that yes, we've received considerable revenue from these tariffs. I'll say this very quickly. If, as I think is likely, Trump will not be able to immediately or stably reimpose tariffs of the same level, And so if the tariff revenue decreases as a result of this decision, this will increase our overall budget deficit, the amount of debt that the United States has to the rest of the world. I'll say this very quickly. The one big beautiful bill passed last year by Congress, when it was priced by the Congressional Budget Office, they assumed that the current tariff rates would stay in place, And so this is going to increase the budget deficit from the one big beautiful bill. Not hugely, The tariffs account for, I think, only about 2% of Treasury's revenue raising. But having said that, in a situation where we are, I think, flirting with an unsustainably high level of deficit, adding another 30 billion a month is not necessarily the greatest thing in the world. I'll say one more thing about what we've learned from the tariffs, and I think this is interesting, right? So in 2024, right, more than half of our imports came from four main trading partners. In 2025, that's contracted to maybe only 40% coming from those four. And the remainder has been made up from other parts in the world. And so the idea that there's a lot of flexibility in a global market that allows manufacturers, suppliers, retailers to substitute from one country to another country if there are tariffs, I think is something that again makes tariffs such a blunt instrument of policy. They don't accomplish what I think the president hoped they were going to accomplish. And let me show you in no uncertain terms the way that they didn't accomplish what he hoped they would accomplish. I think the most important thing he hoped they would accomplish was to reduce our so-called trade deficit. And I want to be as clear as possible here. There's something called balance of payments, right? We talked about this 6 months ago, which looks at the totality of what America sells to the rest of the world and compares that with the totality of what we buy from the rest of the world. And very often that includes, services. Countries around the world buy American software, American music. They pay for the use of products that have American patents, American movies and video games, right? And none of that is reflected in this data, which refers only to goods sold and bought. And in terms of that metric, which is the real focus of Donald Trump and his reason for saying we have a trade deficit, our trade deficit got worse. As a matter of fact, it was record high in 2025 as a whole. The policy appears to coincide with an increase in manufacturing in the United States. And some of this, no doubt, is directly a product of the policy or of some of the trade deals that Donald Trump has secured. And some of it may be a product of the Inflation Reduction Act or other policies secured by Biden, by the previous administration, and some of it may be totally autonomous, right? Nothing to do with this policy. But industrial production has gone up in the United States. One thing to note is a lot of it seems to have gone up before, the tariffs actually took hold. But industrial manufacturing jobs have not increased. As a matter of fact, they've gone down. And so again, part of the problem with using the blunt instrument of tariffs, if what you want to do is increase manufacturing jobs, well, so far they've proven to be not the right policy tool for doing that. Finally, goods from Mexico, goods from China, goods from Canada, all goods imported to the United States. Again, relatively small portion of our overall economy, but they have all become more expensive over the period in which tariffs have been rising, right? And so the idea that this contributes, at least in a minor way, to inflation, I think is important to recognize as well. So final kind of policy dimension to this, what alternatives, are available to Donald Trump and his administration if they want to continue their tariff policy, which all indications are that they do, right? And so we heard this morning that there will be a 15% global tariff, right, which is the maximum tariff permitted under Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, right? And I'll just say this very quickly. that can only be put in place for 150 days and only for serious balance of payment deficits. I've already suggested to you we don't have a balance of payment deficit, but even if, right, by the time this gets litigated, if it does, the 150 days will be up. This is a stopgap measure, right? It does not allow Donald Trump to do what he claimed the authority to do under IEPA, which I'll quote John Roberts, right, that statute does not grant independent power to the president to impose tariffs on imports from any country of any product at any rate for any amount of time. That's what Donald Trump claimed. And by the way, right, Section 232 of right the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 indicates a right much more protracted process for imposing tariffs if there are national security concerns that involves investigation, much less flexibility to do it immediately or to do it on the basis of a whim, and involves congressional, all right, authorization ultimately. Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974 also requires formal investigation and is time capped in the right amount of time tariffs can be imposed for. There's Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, which has basically not been used in right the last 60 odd years. We don't know yet if Donald Trump will try to do that. And so I'll say this, right? We're entering a new terrain, right? A large portion of the tariffs that Donald Trump had imposed, roughly half of them, were imposed with this IEPA authority that has now been struck down by the court. I think we're going to enter a domain now where Donald Trump is going to try to do everything he can to reimpose tariffs, but where the statutes that authorize him to do so are not nearly so permissive, right, as he interpreted IEPA to be. And so we're going to enter a realm of unpredictability. Will there be tariffs? How long will the tariffs last? Will Donald Trump have the power to negotiate trade deals when the countries know if we just wait 150 days, these tariffs are going to go away? Will there be so-called zombie tariffs, right, where he uses Section 232 first and then Section 301 later, and then, right, Section 122 after that or before that. And so I think that the likelihood is that Donald Trump is not going to be able to do everything that he claimed the authority to do under IEPA, but that he's going to do his best to tariff as much as he can, and that this will continue to impact our trade and create further unpredictability about how much supplies are going to cost for many American retailers and manufacturers going forward. One more angle to look at this from. And here, right, I'm going to return to this core question. The system of checks and balances that we have built into our constitutional architecture relies on the idea that we have three co-equal and independent branches of our federal government, each with some overlapping power, and so some power to check the others. And that for most of 2025 and early 2026, this architecture really ground to a halt, did not restrain, I think, exactly what it was designed to restrain: a president who was using his power unilaterally and in many ways lawlessly, and certainly in direct contradiction to the norms governing the legitimate use of power in our country. The Supreme Court yesterday indicated that there are some things it's willing to do to check the president in certain circumstances. Should we view this, or how should we view this in terms of the willingness of the Supreme Court to check the president? And does this perhaps restore a little bit of confidence into the idea that the judiciary is going to function in the way in which the framers envisioned it functioning, as an independent, non-political branch of government? And in saying non-political, what I really mean is non-partisan. That's the language that the judiciary claims for itself. It is functioning on the basis of the interpretation of the Constitution, the statutes in front of it, the precedents in the body of law, as well as the history of that body of law, and not, right, deciding on the basis of loyalty, right? It's interesting that Donald Trump used that language, to the president and the party who appointed a particular judge. So that once you don the black robes, you check your partisanship at the door to the judicial chambers, and you start acting in a different way on the basis of the forum of principles surrounding the Constitution. Is our federal bench working in that way? And I think you have to give a kind of differentiated answer to that. When we look at the district courts, right, the lower level courts that are actually doing the on the ground fact finding, listening to, right, testimony from witnesses, gathering documents, we see those courts behaving quite independently. And by the way, my metric for measuring this is that they only side with Donald Trump 25% of the time. And by the way, the Republican judges not appointed by Trump side with him about 2/3 of the time, but not nearly as often as the Trump appointed judges. Appeals courts, where there are more Trump appointed judges, are siding with Trump roughly 50% of the time, twice as often as the district courts. And the Supreme Court, this doesn't include yesterday's decision, is siding with Donald Trump almost 90% of the time. And if we look in particular at those appeals courts judges, right, the Trump appointed judges are siding with this administration 92% of the time. Note that no other Republican appointed judges are siding nearly that often. The interesting George H.W. Bush, right, judges 75% of the time, Reagan judges 70% of the time, Bush judges only 56% of the time, right? George W. Bush. Whereas the Democratic judges are siding with Trump 30% or less of the time. And I do this, right, just to point out the federal judiciary, and of course, right, to say that it's not a political branch doesn't mean that, right, you check your life experiences, your sensibility, your, right, sympathies at the door to the judicial chambers. That stuff continues to influence judges. And yes, they're appointed by Obama or Trump for a reason, because they believe that their interpretation of the Constitution aligns with the president's interpretation of the Constitution. But the idea that the president's, right, the president who appointed the judge or justice so strongly predicts how they're going to rule, I think is something that we should be concerned about in 2026. And the growing, right, appearance that the federal judiciary is another partisan branch of government, and in particular that the Supreme Court is the judicial wing of the Republican Party. We got a little bit of, right, a corrective on that yesterday. Boy, it would be great for our country, for the rule of law, if the Supreme Court and the federal bench started acting a little bit less partisan and a little bit more like the forum of principle I think it should be. So I've gone on for quite a while, and we haven't talked about affordability, but obviously there was a lot to talk about in terms of the recent Supreme Court case. I'll pause there Do you have questions, things you want to discuss, stuff I haven't hit on, stuff you'd like clarified, um, things you want to add to the conversation? David, are you on the brink of saying something? Yes.
Yes, I am. Um, should Trump go to these new uh, powers to impose tariffs? There's something like a 150-day period that they're good for. And what happens at the end of 150 days?
He would have to go to Congress to get Congress to approve the extension of the tariffs. And 150 days from now is a month from the midterm elections. And I just don't see any scenario in which Congress actually, right, as they're campaigning for reelection, because it would involve getting some support from Democrats, right? And please note that there are some Republicans who are quite critical and skeptical of these tariffs, right? So the idea that you'd be able to assemble at least a somewhat bipartisan majority for tariffs in Congress, I think is dead on arrival, and so. I think yes, and so all the other countries around the world are going to know 150 days from now these tariffs expire, and that dramatically limits the leverage of Donald Trump to use tariffs as instruments either for trade negotiations or just for foreign policy leverage, right? He doesn't like what the European Union is saying about his desire to annex Greenland, and so he threatens to increase tariffs. Nothing to do with right trade relations.
Sure.
Right.
It's all about wielding power, uh, political power over other countries, and I guess. But my question is, did Congress uh, say we don't want you to use these powers to levy these tariffs? I mean, I'm not just talking in principle. I don't think it would ever happen. Uh, or do they have to wait 150 days? Does he have 150 days free reign on these other things? Okay, so
Yes,
it seems to me that the
under
only
statute right now. So Congress would have to revoke the statutory basis and replace
got it.
it with new
Yeah,
statute. Yeah.
that leads me to believe that our only hope for the uh, leverage against Trump is that the tariffs become such a burden economically and such a transparent burden that even the skeptic can see that they're getting screwed by them. Yeah, but I don't know that that will ever happen either.
Yeah, my understanding, I haven't looked at the most recent polling data, but is that the tariffs are not very popular, right? But having said that, I don't think they're unpopular in the way in which ICE is unpopular right now, right? And so and again, this is I think part of the evil genius of Trump's second administration, the so-called flood the zone policy. How much can we pay attention to simultaneously? How much outrage can we feel? And so the idea that right Trump claimed, and let me try to reconstruct the logic for you for a second. And this came out right in the press conference yesterday and in the Truth Media post accompanying the newly announced tariffs, that the United States has been ripped off by all kinds of foreign countries, screwed by China, that the American working class has been deeply damaged by this, and that no president prior to Donald Trump was smart or courageous enough to do anything about it, and that he is the one doing something about it, and what he's doing about it is tariffs, right? And so I'll say two things about this, right? That I think rhetorically and symbolically, you understand why Trump is attracted to tariffs. He's saying, you've been being screwed, right? You, the working class, you, the white, less educated voter in the United States, you who live in the Rust Belt, etc., for 30 years. And, whether it's George W. Bush or Barack Obama, these presidents actually aided and abetted, right, the hollowing out of the manufacturing economy of the United States. And I'm doing something about it on day one. I signed the executive order directing my administration to come up with tariffs on day one. And then Liberation Day, I did it, right? And so this is not your typical president. This is someone who feels your pain, understands your anger and your grievance, and does something about it right away, right? Now, it turns out what he does is illegal on the one hand, right? And on the other hand, it's worthwhile noting counterproductive. And
Exactly.
that's right, that the real rub here. How many of his supporters at this point understand that this is counterproductive? Or alternatively, how many of them just say, he's my man, right? He's the first one who feels my pain, who articulated my grievance, who did something about it, and now the damn Supreme Court is getting in his way. Screw the Supreme Court, right? And I suspect both of those reactions are going to occur, right? And that part of the reason that Trump is doubling down and trying to find some statutory authority to continue doing the tariffs is because he wants to be able to continue to play the card with his supporters. Look, I'm doing everything I can. It's just the damn Supreme Court or the deep state or the liberal elite that are in my way. And I'll say this very quickly. I do think the tariffs are counterproductive. I do think that some of his supporters are beginning to understand this, but I also don't believe, right, that the tariffs are the most pressing threat to either the economic well-being or the liberty of the people of the United States right now. And so we've got to also just kind of pick our battles. If the strategy is to overwhelm us and distract us, we need to be focused on what ICE is doing with detentions, right? What ICE is doing with habeas corpus and bonds, what ICE is doing to, and I'm saying ICE, Department of Homeland Security officials are doing to try to brutalize people who are bearing witness to their abuse of power, right? That seems to me the more urgent, right, of these priorities. David, did you want to follow up? I'm not sure if okay.
No,
John,
it's just that it's
oh,
clear other forms of leverage are important. That's all.
John,
I missed the early part of the lecture, I'm sorry to say, and you may have already talked about this, but the State of the Union is coming up at 3 o'clock on Tuesday. And I'm wondering what the people in the White House who feel responsible for making President Trump popular and so forth, what they are racking their brains to do to think about what they can do about what he's going to say in front of Congress in a speech that's going to run more than an hour and where he's going to be heckled. And given what he's been saying in speeches lately, one can only imagine.
yeah, and so you feel a little bit of sympathy for Susie Wiles right now. Right. I mean, and so, someone I'm not inclined to like, but we
It's
saw that.
more curiosity than it is sympathy.
Okay. Yeah. So you'd like to be a fly on that wall. I saw a meme the other day of Donald Trump looking bored and bemused, and the line at the bottom was an aide trying to explain to Donald Trump for the fifth time that he can't pardon Prince Andrews, right? He's a very stubborn man, and I think what we saw in the press conference yesterday, he had a prepared text, right? And he couldn't bring himself to read it without annotating it, right? So he read a little bit, he went on a riff. He read a little bit, he went on a riff. I do think some of the insulting of the Supreme Court justices, calling them lapdogs, calling them dummies, idiots, fools, right, beholden to sleazeballs and rhinos, was actually in the text and not Donald Trump right, going extemporaneous. And so I do think another question here is going to be, on the one hand, obviously Donald Trump is not someone who's disciplined in sticking to the teleprompter or the written text. But on the other hand, this is an administration that doesn't do a lot to bridle Donald Trump, unlike the first administration. So how much are they just going to write what he wants to say to Congress Tuesday? Yeah, it'll be interesting to watch, and I suspect we're going to see a lot of anger from Donald Trump, and he's trying to figure out obviously what in the world he can do to avoid losing Congress in 10 months, right? And I don't know if there's anything he can do at this point, but I don't think the anger, the bile helps him. Go ahead, John.
I have this vision. I don't think it's very realistic, but we're watching the State of the Union and he's up in front. And about a half an hour in, he starts turning around and around and around and then faster and faster and faster. Then he disappears in a puff of smoke.
The whirling dervish
Right.
/ cartoon version. Yeah, no,
Awesome.
wouldn't that be an interesting solution to the Trump problem? I don't think so, alas.
I don't think so.
Yeah, or he bursts a blood vessel in his face because he's so angry. Yeah, go ahead, Barbara. You're still muted, but I think you know that, right? So I'm trying to help you. If you hold down your space bar, no. If you push that little microphone icon, no. Sorry, Barbara. If you figure out how to do it, let us know. There you go.
I think
Yeah,
you and I were time for the body double.
the body double. Yes,
Either
yes,
for the whirling dervish or a perfectly wonderful speech.
yeah.
I think there
Hope
are.
springs eternal. Flossie, it looks like you might have something to say too.
Well, it becomes clearer to me every day that not all of our criminals are in prison. They're running around and they're having a good time. And prison is nothing that we can threaten them with. They don't care. Um, there comes a point when you get away with murder, and then, and then, and then, when things come back, become so disgusting, or let's say when Epstein has his day, maybe justice will come. But I think we forget the meaning of justice after a while, because if the gang, the gang that prevails has no conscience, has no sense of what life asks us to do, then why not throw everything to the winds? Just join the crowd. And if you get, tossed up a little bit, you bounce back. And what you bounce into, well, that will come and it will come. It's a kind of, there comes a point where life has no meaning. And I begin to think that it's going to happen soon.
Ah, that's an awful thought, Flossie, and so I'm gonna bring it back to what I can speak about.
Oh, yeah.
First, in terms of politics, and then I'll say a little bit more about the existential dimension to this. In terms of politics, on the one hand, right, the Supreme Court 2 years ago gave Donald Trump and every president in the United States immunity from prosecution for, right, criminal acts conducted while in office, so long as they are at the core or near to the core of their duties, right? And so, in a sense, I think you're absolutely right that there is now a sense of complete immunity. And by the way, I'm not sure that would have restrained Trump even if he thought he was accountable. I'll pivot for a second to the Epstein files, and I have not spoken at length about them with you. They're so and I'm going to use kind of Victorian language here, unsavory, right? That they're so gross. I feel so dirty when I look at what they tell me. And by the way, I don't know if you're paying attention to this, but it does appear that there is at least one slide that the Department of Justice prepared in 2019 that suggests that Donald Trump did, in fact, engage in some of the sex with underage girls, right? Minors. So statutory rape. Um, and right, I don't know. It appears that most of the evidence concerning Trump, if there is evidence, has been scrubbed or removed or redacted, but some of it might have got through, and whether there's going to be any accounting for that or not. But the broader picture, right, is one in which there's a quite extensive economic, but not only economic elite that seems to believe that ordinary legal and moral constraints do not apply to them, right? So the idea that there are just an awful lot of predatory people who congregated around Jeffrey Epstein. And the idea that this confirms, in a sense, I think, the worst suspicions of many already somewhat paranoid Americans, that there's just two rules, right? And you talk about, putting people in jail. I think one of the things we should pay attention to is how many people are in jail who shouldn't be in jail, in addition to how many people who should be in jail aren't in jail. And it does make you think
Yes,
that the
yes.
whole system is just stacked or rigged in such a way that there are a large number of people who, because of their wealth and their power, just feel that they can skate away from whatever they do. Now, does that mean that we then conclude in what I'm going to call a kind of nihilistic place? They get away with it. Other people who do right much less or nothing at all end up in jail for long times because of racism and racial profiling, or just their lack of resources to afford counsel, or because, right, the whole way in which plea bargaining works essentially coerces innocent people to confess to crimes they didn't commit. I can't deny any of that. But I will tell you, I'm teaching Immanuel Kant at the college right now, right? And I will just say, Kant says, act as if you already belong to a kingdom of ends, right? A society, and I think probably the better phrase would be a realm of ends, a society in which every person considers humanity in themselves and everyone else an end in itself, as everyone having intrinsic value and dignity, and as worthy of respect because we have a capacity for morality. And Kant says it doesn't matter how corrupt and how vile the world you live in is. The one thing you can do is comport yourself in the way that morality requires of you. And my students started talking about Gandhi and King and Mandela, and I'll just point out to you, right, that Mahatma Gandhi was directly or indirectly influenced by this Kantian philosophy, and he did conduct himself with the dignity and the morality of, right, the world he wanted to live in and not the world he did live in. And his example actually changed people, right? It awakened a kind of moral conscience in them that made it hard for them to continue being as immoral as they were. And the conditions are very different in the 21st century than they were in the 20th century, but nevertheless, I think we have to hope that this kind of exemplary morality and this uh, you know sense that what we can control is our own morality is still um, able to inspire us. Because if it isn't, then you're right that these vile people are actually representatives of the future world that we're entering. But I really think that we have to hold firm against that to the best of our ability and continue
And
to
we
maintain
will.
standards that we don't think those people in power are maintaining, because they matter to us intrinsically, even if, right, you know, the people in power are completely unwilling to comport themselves accordingly. Go ahead, Flossie.
Honestly, David, when the time comes, this gang of oldies of Piedmont gardeners will be out in the streets yelling and screaming. And we have done it several times, but this time they can come and arrest us. And that will be a day
The
when
the
they fly,
next
yes.
the next No King's Day, does anybody know the date? Um, it's coming up, right? It's next month, right? So I assume that's in part what you're talking about. And yes, when our right politics is so corrupt that we can't use our institution. March 28th. Oh no, that's 2025. Sorry. I'm trying to look it up, but when we feel that our institutions have been captured, no longer work for us, we still have recourse. We take our politics to the street, right? And we attempt to demonstrate to our fellow citizens in the way that the brave people of Minneapolis did for so long. We will not simply capitulate to this level of corruption. So yes, I appreciate what you're saying, Flossie.
We
Thank
have
you,
a lot
as
of
always, for a good, provocative, interesting comment.
wheelchairs that can still move.
Yes, yes, yeah, and the right the body may not work the way that it once did, but the spirit is intact. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, so we're well over time. We have not talked about abundance, affordability, and well-being one iota, but I think we had more than enough to handle today.
Thank you.
I'll do my best to finish that topic with you soon. You all be well, be courageous. There is some, right, I think grounds for a little bit of cautious hope in this most recent Supreme Court decision. Let's not lose track of that. And we will continue the conversation next week. Take care, everybody. Thanks, guys. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you, David.
Pleasure as always. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you.
Be well.